Muli, dear brothers and sisters. From our first reading, we heard that the priests brought the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to its place beneath the wings of the cherubim in the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies of the temple. What was there in that Ark of the Covenant? There was nothing in the ark but the 2 stone tablets which Moses had put there at Horeb when the Lord made the covenant with the Israelites at their departure from the land of Egypt. That is what we hear from chapter 8 of the first book of Kings. You know, sometimes I use my imagination and entertain the thought of how King Nebuchadnezzar must have been so disappointed when he invaded the city of Jerusalem and ransacked the Jewish temple in 586 BC. He was probably expecting to take home the treasures that he thought he was going to find inside the fabled Ark of the Covenant. Oh, the poor Babylonian emperor must have been expecting to find precious gems, jewels with pearls and diamonds inside the elaborately decorated treasure chest, which the Jewish people called the Ark of the Covenant. And the fact that it had 2 angels kneeling above it with their wings folded over the chest as if really to guard it must have added fascination to what this ark contained. It was even kept in the innermost sanctum of the temple, which the Jews called the Holy of Holies, and accompanied by a perpetual fire that was to be guarded by the priests, who had to make sure that the fire would never be extinguished. And so, on that day that Nebuchadnezzar ransacked Jerusalem, what did he find inside the Ark of the Covenant? 2 stone tablets. Nothing else. He must have felt like he had been tricked. He must have gotten so upset that he decided to burn down the whole temple and allowed the fabled ark to be buried in the rubble. No wonder the Hollywood filmmakers had been kept busy telling fantastic stories about the raiders of the lost ark. How could the king of Babylon have known that those stone tablets, which seemed totally worthless to him, were really the treasure? They contained the words of the covenant that meant the whole world to Israel. We call them the 10 Commandments. I prefer to call them the 10 Commitments. In Tagalog, I'd rather call them kasunduan and kautusan. They were not just a set of duties and obligations for Israel. Rather, they represented their call to a committed relationship with their God, what they called covenant, which the prophet Hosea even dramatized with his own love story. And if we now fast forward from there to Jesus, the Rabbi of the New Testament, we would understand why he summarized the 10 Commandments into 2. For him, the 2 stone tablets stood for the 2 loves spoken about in the Torah. The first love, which is better known as the Great Shema. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. The call to a wholehearted love. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord alone. Therefore, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And the second love from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, which insists that for Israel to be holy as Yahweh their God was holy, they had to learn to love their neighbors as themselves. Let me just quickly share my reflection on two questions. First, why must we love God wholeheartedly? And second, why must we love our neighbor as ourselves? Why must we love God wholeheartedly? The logic of the Great Shema is very simple. Because that is how much God Himself has loved us. Not half-heartedly, but wholeheartedly. And if you are image and likeness of this God who loves wholeheartedly, you must be wholehearted yourself in love. My father used to tell me that when I was just a little boy, he would say, Ambo, remember, make it a point that with anything you do, you always try to do your best. Either you give it your best shot or you don't do it at all. And I think one of the curses of our modern times is the tendency towards mediocrity. Pwede na yan. Mediocrity or half-heartedness. Isn't it tragic to hear of people who are still so young but with no more fire in their bellies? People who do what they do half-heartedly, dragging their feet to school or to church or to work, but unable to see their life's meaning and purpose, just going through the motions of being alive. And remember what the Lord says in Revelation 3? I know your works. I know that you are neither hot nor cold. And I wish you were either cold or hot. Because you are lukewarm, because you are neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich and affluent and have no need of anything, and yet do not realize how wretched really you are. How pitiable, how poor, how blind, how naked. And so I advise you, buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you may be rich. Buy from white garments to put on, so that your shameful nakedness may not be exposed. And buy from me ointment to smear on your eyes, so that you may see. Remember those whom I love, I test in the crucible of fire. The second question, what does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? Well, it means to treat them no longer as other, but as your very self, as your own brother, sister, mother, father, son, or daughter, or friend. Incidentally, this is what I shared about in the recent PCME, where I was assigned to reflect on the theme, and who is my neighbor? The occasion for the topic is the theme that has been set by the CBCP for this year in the context of our 9-year preparation for 2021, the 500th year of Christianity, the year of dialogues, threefold dialogues. Dialogues with fellow Christians who are not necessarily the Roman Catholic tradition, dialogue with other communities of faith, and dialogue with the indigenous cultures. I began by reflecting on dialogue itself as the process by which others become no longer other. In Tagalog, ang pakikipagkapwa ay kapag ang iba ay magsimula ng maging hindi iba sa atin. The opposite of dialogue is what I call the process of othering. That is, when we would rather emphasize the otherness of fellow human beings in order to justify what we perceive to be a need to distance ourselves from them, such as when specific sectors of society are vilified and labeled. And a typical label we hear now are drug suspects, criminals, communists, subversives, terrorists, migrants, foreigners, etc. There is nothing new about this strategy. Bulok na yung style na to. This was Hitler's effective populist strategy in isolating the Jews from the German society. It is how he succeeded in keeping people quiet, even if they were aware that he was already exterminating them in gas chambers. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why we are so panicky about the novel coronavirus, forgetting that there is a more serious virus of indifference that is afflicting the Philippine society, which has killed thousands already. And we're in panic because one Chinese dead died. I do not mean to be racist, but we are in panic. But we're not in panic that close to 30,000 people have died. You remember the famous lines by the German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller, who said, "First they came for the Jews, but I did nothing because I'm not a Jew. And then they came for the socialists, but I did nothing because I'm not a socialist." So I was quoting Niemöller. This, I did nothing because I am not a socialist. And then they came for the Catholics, and I did nothing because I am not a Catholic. Finally, they came for me, but by then, there was no one left to help me. Why? Because they had been conditioned to treat them as others, as non-neighbors. It is through othering that the definition of neighbor gets narrowed and narrowed and narrowed down. Who then is my neighbor? You remember this was the follow-up question of an expert of the law in Luke's introduction to the parable of the Good Samaritan. The parable itself follows. But if you miss out the introduction, you miss the whole point. The question was begging for an answer based on the law. Very typical of Midrash. A kind of Midrash called halakhic Midrash, which asks for a legal explanation. Is it lawful to do this? Is it lawful to do that? But Jesus often shifts to a different kind of Midrash that they knew as Haggadic Midrash. He would answer instead with a story or with a parable in its original form. And we have evidence from the Talmud for this. Did you know that the original parable must have been the parable of the good Israelites? Meaning, the third character was a lay person. The first traveler
was a priest, the second was a Levite, both officials of the temple. And it was the non-official, the ordinary lay person, who expressed compassion. It was a whole polemic against the temple. And so you see, when Jesus started telling the story, the lawyer must have been expecting him to narrate it in exactly the same way. And he was ready to sustain the debate about the neighbor, because the victim in the story is anonymous. He was ready with follow-up questions like, what if the victim is a Gentile? What if the victim is a bandit? What if the victim is a rebel? What if the victim is a Samaritan? Am I still obliged to help him? Well, he's trying to limit the definition of neighbor, and was sort of trying to suggest that only the fellow Israelite is to be treated as a neighbor. Suddenly, and surely unexpectedly, Jesus pulled the rug from under his feet by revising the ending. He changed the third character into a Samaritan. And then he reformulated the question, who is my neighbor? It becomes, who of the three was neighbor to the victim? And the question stuns the lawyer, who is unprepared for it. If he were the victim, would he begrudge being helped by a Samaritan? If you were in Indonesia somewhere, would you begrudge the help of a Muslim? The lawyer, who is put on the spot and would not even mention the term Samaritan, now awkwardly answers by saying, I suppose the one who had compassion on the victim. And Jesus ends with the ultimate rub-in. Okay, go and do likewise. Meaning, go and imitate the Samaritan. An ultimate insult to the Jews. You see, this was a very timely text for the CBCP theme for 2020. And very appropriate too for the gospel. About Jesus, who made the rounds. According to the gospel today, he made the rounds, healing the sick, liberating those oppressed by unclean spirits, without asking about their political colors, or about their religious affiliations, or if they were ritually clean or unclean. He was the walking covenant. And why would touching even the tassel of his cloak have so much power? Because the covenant has taken flesh in his person. The covenant are no longer 2 stone tablets. For us, the covenant is Jesus. In his person, divinity and humanity have become one. He has become God's permanent connection to humanity, and humanity's permanent connection to God. And now, our tabernacles no longer contain 2 stone tablets. Rather, they bear a piece of bread, a little piece of wafer that would be totally worthless to thieves. Sometimes thieves break into adoration chapels and they steal the monstrance. And the stupid fools don't realize that the monstrance is just the container for the treasure. Some of them even take time to remove that little worthless piece of wafer. which now means the whole world to us. Because it is the sacrament of love, of that body broken on the cross, the body broken for broken people. I just want to end with a question. I cannot get myself to understand why this Eucharist has become an exclusive meal for the righteous, when it was meant to be the bread broken, a body broken, for broken people like ourselves.